Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 242. And this time I'm going to talk about Wayne Shorter's album from 1964, released on Blue Note, Night Dreamer. This is a 2015 reissue, part of the Blue Note 75th Anniversary series. Not everybody has the same experience with this pressing, but it sounds pretty good to my uncultured ears. At this point in his career, Wayne Shorter has completed a fairly extensive hard bop apprenticeship with Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. He's also made 3 of his own records as a leader for Vee-Jay, all of which are solid hard bop outings. But this is his first record for Blue Note. It also coincides with his recruitment by Miles Davis, and here he clearly moves beyond a simple hard bop track list. There's modal jazz here, there's blues, and there's incredible virtuosity from a really talented front line of Wayne Shorter and the trumpeter Lee Morgan. There's also the lovely light touch of 2/3 of Coltrane's rhythm section at the time, McCoy Tyner on piano and Elvin Jones on drums. As such, this record is a significant step forward for Shorter and begins one of the great runs in jazz in the 1960s. Wayne Shorter's had an incredible career in jazz, starting with swing, bebop, moving on to hard bop, modal jazz, fusion, jazz funk, world music, and then into jazz's postmodern era after 1990. When I reviewed his record Speak No Evil, I talked about how he came from Newark, how his roots were in bebop as he and his friends and his brother Alan tried to imitate their heroes Gillespie, Parker, and Monk. Then his musical education at NYU in the 1950s, followed by his stint in the Army and a growing personal and musical friendship with John Coltrane, who was an admirer. That connection to Coltrane turns out to be quite fortuitous for Shorter because it ends up in kind of a roundabout way leading to his involvement in Miles' second great quintet. Originally, in 1959, when Coltrane was on his second stint with Miles and was thinking of leaving because that town wasn't big enough for the both of them by that point, he recommended Shorter repeatedly to Miles as a potential replacement. At that point, the timing wasn't really right, and Miles wasn't that certain anyway. So Shorter ends up joining Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers after an invitation from the talented young trumpeter Lee Morgan, with whom he'd formed a great musical friendship. Shorter ends up staying with Blakey until 1963, and in this period he releases his first 3 albums as a leader on Vee-Jay Records. Now, a little sidebar on Vee-Jay, which is kind of a cool label. It was a family-owned company. It was also one of the very first black-owned record labels in the United States. It's founded in 1953 in Gary, Indiana, which is basically a suburb of Chicago. Its founders were a married couple, Vivian Carter and James Bracken. It goes on to be quite a force in blues, R&B, and pop, and in fact, it's basically the most successful black-owned label in the States until the emergence of Motown later in the 60s. Vee-Jay is famous for quite a few things. For instance, there are great Chicago blues artists like Jimmy Reed and John Lee Hooker. Also, they had some great pop acts like the Four Seasons in the early 1960s. In 1963, they also picked up the US distribution rights to a band from the UK that Capitol Records wasn't quite sure on at the time. Ironically, what should have been their big break actually ends up being their downfall when Capitol, realizing their big mistake, ends up drowning Vee-Jay in lawsuits, and that basically does for the company. For his part, Wayne Shorter had signed for Vee-Jay in 1959, walking through a door largely opened by Miles Davis's piano player, Wynton Kelly, and of course Shorter had played on Kelly's album from 1959 on Vee-Jay, Kelly Great. The records that Shorter made for Vee-Jay include Introducing Wayne Shorter in 1959 and Waning Moments in 1962. There's also a third record called Second Genesis, which was recorded in 1960 but doesn't come out until 1974. These records are all pretty good records, all fairly solid hard bop, not necessarily as experimental or as cutting edge as some of his later stuff on Blue Note, but still pretty good and worth picking up, as I plan to do. In his time with the Jazz Messengers, Shorter matured remarkably as a composer. He was quite young still, but he became the musical director of the band, and he appears in all kinds of great records, something like 20 to 25 records. These include, but are not limited to, A Night in Tunisia, The Freedom Rider, Behind His Delight, Art Blakey, exclamation marks, Jazz Messengers, exclamation marks on Impulse, Mosaic, and Caravan. Now, Blakey had a formula which was exciting hard bop fired by excellent young horn players in the front line, and Shorter could have continued in this vein, but life in Blakey's band was pretty hard, particularly for the cohort of drug users, which did not include Shorter. This was too much for Wayne Shorter's friend Lee Morgan by late 1961, and so he leaves the band, starts to spiral downwards actually, and really bottoms out before making a bit of a comeback in the later 1960s. And by 1964, Shorter himself felt it was time to move on to seek new horizons. Now, back to Miles Davis, who wasn't that keen on recruiting Shorter in 1959, but I think had come to recognize the error of his ways and had been keeping tabs on Shorter the whole time he was with the Jazz Messengers. In 1964, the planets align, and Miles is putting together a new quintet. He's got Tony Williams on drums. He's got Herbie Hancock on piano. He's got Ron Carter on bass. He also has, at the time, George Coleman on saxophone. And while Coleman is a great sax player, and Miles actually thought quite a lot of him, particularly as Miles was suffering all kinds of health problems around this time, and Coleman was really carrying the weight in their live performances because sometimes Miles, who had really bad hip trouble, wasn't able to perform. Coleman's style, which is a little more retro, was not really hip with the younger members of the band like Carter, Williams, and Hancock. They thought he was basically out of date. He wanted to play all these chord changes. They wanted to play modal jazz. They teased him, but there was a bit of an edge to it. This and the fact that Miles was constantly relying on Coleman to bail him out of situations where Miles wasn't feeling well enough to play causes Coleman to leave. When Coleman leaves and Miles then finds out that Shorter is available, he lines him up pretty much within 24 hours. He sends him a made-to-measure tux and a first-class ticket to join the band in LA. Wayne accepts and flies out to complete the lineup of the Second Great Quintet, and around this time he also signs for Blue Note, recording a total of 11 records for them, of which this is the first. This record's recorded in one session on April 29, 1964, 2 days after Lyndon Johnson had outraged dog lovers around the world by lifting up his beagles by their ears during a photo shoot at the White House. It's made at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, and naturally Alfred Lion is in the producer's chair. Wayne Shorter, of course, is on tenor. Shorter is, of course, one of the greatest and most prolific composers of post-war jazz, and here he's really hitting his stride. This is the first record he puts out where it's all his own compositions. On trumpet is Shorter's good friend from the Blakey group, Lee Morgan, that brilliant and talented musician and tragic musician who played so well every time that he and Shorter lined up together in a front line. Morgan had also played on Shorter's debut in 1959. Rounding out the lineup are three musicians who are quite well known for playing with John Coltrane, including Elvin Jones and McCoy Tyner, who at that point were part of Coltrane's classic quartet, along with Jimmy Garrison. The third of those is Reggie Workman, who had been replaced by Garrison in Coltrane's quartet and had gone on to join the Jazz Messengers, leaving at the same time as Shorter. The photo on the cover is, of course, by Francis Wolff, and it's a nighttime scene of Wayne Shorter somewhere on a street in New York around the time the record was made. This is not a gatefold, but on the original gatefold you can see a much crisper image which is taken from the same photo shoot. The design, of course, like so many of these Blue Note designs, was by Reed Miles. Side 1 starts with the title track, which begins with this shimmering opening by Tyner, and Shorter's solo, one of the best I think in his whole catalog, has this whole series of bluesy descending runs. Then we have Morgan with an equally impressive solo, a slightly different feel, and then Tyner, who is a bit flashier as he's the dominant accompanist with his left hand while soloing with his right. Shorter's solo in the fade out is fantastic, and I regret the fact they faded it out so soon. Oriental Folk Song is actually a song which Shorter heard apparently on a TV commercial and then adapted for this. He conjures all kinds of elastic sounds out of his tenor sax. Morgan is also just as much the star on this as Shorter. Tyner himself a little more reserved than on the first track. The final track on side 1, Virgo, is I think the highlight of the whole record. Shorter's tone here and just the whole feel of this track is a bit of a throwback at times. It almost feels a little bit pre-war at points. I'm drawn again and again to the incredible beauty of Jones's playing, effortless genius, and the same can be said very much about Tyner's decorative accompaniments. Side 2 starts with Black Nile, which is a celebration of the black civilization of Egypt. It conjures up very effectively the feeling of a flowing river. Shorter has some runs which approximate Coltrane at his most urgent. He's matched by Morgan, and another highlight is the short but technically excellent solo by Jones towards the end. Charcoal Blues, unsurprisingly from the title, is probably the bluesiest track in the record. It's another throwback. This track could easily have been on any Coltrane or Rollins record from, say, 1957 or 1958, not least because the tenor work is top drawer. The final track, Armageddon, I love so much, particularly once the tune settles down into the heart of it, with Shorter and Jones and Morgan all going to town. Morgan's contributions are maybe more selective than the other two, but they are the definition of tasteful, and this is also Tyner's most expressive contribution to the whole of this record as well. This LP is a rare combination of exciting and languorous, a perfect late evening listen, ideally over a couple of fingers of Lafroig or your favorite tipple, covering all kinds of different terrain through Shorter's brilliant and appealing compositions. There are plenty of echoes of his old friend John Coltrane's work, which of course was so influential at the time, but Shorter's playing is just that much smoother. And if you want to understand why Wayne Shorter was one of the only jazz composers that Miles Davis felt was his equal, look no further than this record, which will seduce you from the very first notes. It's a brilliant start to a brilliant run and one of his great career offerings, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.